For as far as I can remember, I've always had this fascination for the internet. Growing up in the late 90s, a time where computers weren't accessible everywhere contributed heavily to my interest for anything online. I wasn't exactly well versed with most things technological back then. I just knew that video games were on the TV and that my mom happened to have a computer in her office. Now that I'm significantly older and have a better understanding of technology, or at least I think I do, I realized that the internet is just this vast series of networks connecting computers across the world. But back when I was a kid, it felt almost magical. Whether it's video games, cartoons, or any other form of media, you've probably already seen something that portrays the internet as a solid, tangible setting. The idea of a gateway to another world wasn't exactly a new concept. I was already vicariously living through many other fantasy worlds. But at the time, the idea of being transported into a concept as foreign as the internet felt very special to me. Here's a couple of my favorite examples. Reboot, a cartoon where the main cast lives inside Mainframe, this computer system, and about how they defend it from viruses. Mega Man Battle Network, a game about a world where the internet has become integrated with almost every aspect of daily life. Serial Experiments Lane, specifically for the Wired, this strange virtual realm and the philosophical topic it approaches, like reality, identity, and communication. Similarly, there's also the entirety of Project .hack, this very creative take on a fictional MMORPG, exploring themes like anxiety, escapism, and interpersonal relationships. Each piece of media having drastically different approaches on what type of story they want to tell, or even how they depict the cyberspace itself, yet each of them use similar plot elements and settings. But if there's one franchise that really sparked that interest for me, it was Digimon. The digital world rides that fine line between idealistic fantasy landscape and otherworldly computer software. It's something I had practically never seen as a kid, so it definitely left an impact on me. The series practically followed me throughout the years, and just a couple months ago I decided to indulge in some nostalgia. I reviewed Digimon World DS, the only game from the franchise I grew up playing. At the time of its release in 2006, Digimon games were still trying to figure out what they wanted to be. Half of them were monster raising simulators closer to virtual pets in nature, while the other half was, well, pretty much anything else. Even though Digimon World DS did have its fair share of flaws and almost felt prototypical at times, I couldn't be too hard on it. For being the first entry in the Digimon story series, I think Digimon World DS did pretty alright, and eventually would serve as a basis for future games to come. Once again developed by BEC, Digimon World Dawn and Dusk are the next installment of the Digimon story series. Despite their localized name, they're not related to the Digimon World series. We kinda got the short end of the stick when it came to naming convention. Japan got the infinitely cooler sounding Sunburst and Moonlight. They would both release on the Nintendo DS in March 2007 in Japan and September of the same year for North America. As a kid, I never really got into Dawn and Dusk. I remember playing through a little bit of it via emulation, but it didn't really grip me. Since it came out less than a year after World DS, I probably didn't feel the need to play another Digimon game right away, especially in the time where the Wii had just come out. I was too busy crying about how much I wanted to look like Link. But you know, times have changed. I'm a person of better taste and eternal masochism, so obviously I was gonna review this eventually. Before I start, it's probably a good idea to watch my Digimon World DS review before this, since I'll be drawing a lot of comparisons between both games. It's in no way mandatory to enjoy this video, but it would probably help a bit when I start talking about mechanics and my criticisms about the game. Even though Dawn and Dusk are two separate titles, they kinda act as your typical split version monster tamer games. There's different Digimon available in each version, and both games have parallel storylines, each mirroring the same major plot beats but with slightly different main cast. Oh, and the overall color scheme changes depending on which game you're playing. Dawn favors orange and yellow, while Dusk is more pink and purple. Even though I can definitely praise the game for being a little more than what you'd expect out of a split version, the differences felt extremely minor, and I didn't have the stomach to go through both versions entirely. So for this playthrough, I stuck with Dusk, and I'll be referring to the game simply as that for the rest of the video. I'll still be covering some Dawn elements when they come up, but that's a bit later. After the very short intro, you get to pick your name and avatar. Small side note, but it's only after I finished the game that someone told me there's technically canon protagonists for each version. Dawn is usually represented with Ko, while Dusk gets Sayo. The latter even makes an appearance in Cyber Sleuth. If you pick the opposite of the canon character, you instead get those adorable color swaps of each, and I don't know why, I kinda prefer them over their original counterpart, so I ended up going with this little guy for my playthrough. Unlike World DS, which throws you instantly in the story, Dusk instead opens up with a choice between 4 starting themes, a well-appreciated feature coming back from Digimon World 3. Each team features 3 Digimon, but each of them share your version-exclusive monster, in my case Lunamon. Really wasn't hard to pick here. Skullgreymon and Black Weregarurumon on the same team was enough for me. Once you're done picking a starter pack, you're thrown to a pretty lengthy intro segment explaining the basics of the plot. You're a member of Nightcrow, a team of tamers, and you're currently training with your friends in order to participate in an upcoming tournament. During your training session though, you're attacked by a gang of Digimon from the area who are usually friendly. Ah yes, the friendly Vilemon. Its Japanese name being literally Evilmon, you know, the one that looks like that? Anyway, you eventually catch a glimpse of a mysterious cloak figure, and those strange events culminate the next day at the Digi Coliseum. Right after your victory in the finals, there's a mysterious entity that infects the entire digital world and degenerates every Digimon back to their egg form. Yours are instead reverted to the rookie form because, you know, it's convenient for the plot. Your goal from that point forward is to figure out how to return Dark Moon City, as well as the entirety of the digital world, to its former glory, and to discover who's responsible for that. If I have to nitpick a bit, I'd say the intro drags on for just a bit too long. Even though Digimon World DS also suffered from a pretty sizable opening segment, the premise felt a bit more appealing to me. You were a kid that just happened to get lost in the digital world. There was something charming about that mystery and I wanted to know more. Meanwhile, at the 40-minute mark in Dusk, I was still being introduced to more and more characters from each team. The setup to the main plot felt very slow and eventually devolved into your typical must stop the unknown bad guy. It's not all negative though. I did appreciate some of the supporting cast. I came in expecting the rival team to feel antagonistic, because, you know, we're rivals. But despite their giant fire-breathing monsters clashing with my own, they're still just kids play fighting. They're constantly cheering for each other, sometimes even for the opposite team, and it felt like a welcome change compared to Kane from the previous game. I just wish the main cast was a bit smaller. Maybe that would create more opportunities for character development. Because caring about a dozen of them just shoved in your face at the start of the game felt pretty weird. Also, I kinda miss seeing my protagonist have its own dialogue. This time around, your main character only reacts to things physically, and instead it's the supporting cast that does the talking. It's a bit of a weird decision, especially when at times it felt like my rival got more screen time than I did. As for the visual side of things, I'm still a big fan of how the game looks. Like I mentioned previously, a huge part of my interest in Digimon came from world building and how it successfully blends both fantasy and technology. Unfortunately, a lot of the areas you'll visit throughout the game are recolors from the previous game. I think the only completely new zone are the main hub, the Digi Coliseum, and your home. And while I still think they look great, I would have definitely loved some more unique areas. The sprite work in the handheld Digimon games always looked great, so I'm not exactly upset they reused something that looks good. As a matter of fact, they managed to take my favorite area from last game, one that barely got any screen time, and turned it into its own mini dungeon you can find throughout the game. The music there is an absolute banger, by the way. They also recycled the same user interface, but this time in a different shade for each version. I was already a big fan of the presentation in World DS, so Dusk seems to only expand upon it. The character sprites and portraits did their job just fine. Your team of Digimon still follow you anywhere you go, and that remains one of my favorite little detail. With the roster going from 200 to 350 available Digimon, it felt really cool to see them walking around. Some of them are recolors, but that's nothing exactly new to the franchise. There's plenty of my favorite Digimon that are effectively just color swaps of more popular ones. With the expanded roster, we also got a ton of new battle sprites. It's been fun to see some of the less popular Digimon make appearances here, or even some that just got glossed over last game. Each monster looks as charming as ever, and the newer sprites don't differ stylistically from the previous one, so they don't look out of place. A bit of a sour note for me, but the battle effects still leave a lot to be desired. The game constantly reused those very bland animation for each move, and with some of your best attacks chaining up to 3 of these back to back, it makes combat look a bit cheap. Overall, I think the game looks great, even though it does feel like an upgraded version of World DS instead of its own thing, which is something you can say about the gameplay itself. Digimon World Dusk is a fairly standard JRPG with an emphasis on random battles and monster taming elements. The bulk of the gameplay remains the same, and what new concept they do introduce feel like a very shy first attempt. Like its predecessor, you'll spend most of your time traveling from zone to zone, fulfilling quests and battling wild Digimon. Battles reuse the same turn-based grid system in which your team of 3 fend off against anywhere from 1 to 5 wild Digimon. While it does feel pretty straightforward, I can appreciate some of what Dusk brings to the table. I don't know if it's just me, but I noticed a lot more emphasis on status effect. It's the first time in the series where I actually used healing items on my Digimon instead of just pummeling the enemy before my team died. Even though I did notice that the spirit stat is kinda useless. Some enemies have attacks that reduce spirit, but it seems to be only used to determine how much stats your Digimon gain from level ups. So in battle it feels very much like a non-effect, since it doesn't carry over and you're healed of status effects after a fight anyway. This isn't exactly an issue, but I just found it funny that a stat down effect just did nothing. A new addition to Dusk was how the quest system works. Most RPGs would usually have you go to the main story at your own pace, being able to pick side quests here and there whenever you feel like it. Digimon almost does that. Every quest you'll do has to be picked up at a counter in your main hub. You then have to go find and talk to the appropriate quest NPC in your city, and then you're free to go to whatever zone is needed for your objective. When you eventually come back to town, you'll have to return to that NPC, then the counter again to turn in the quest. On one hand, I'm kinda glad they separated side content from the Digifarm, cause last time I practically skipped over all of them. But at the same time, I'm really not feeling the whole mandatory side quest thing. Every main story event requires at least 2 side quests done before they're unlocked. According to the quest tracker, I finished the main story with about 54% of all quests done. I'm sure there's some lore explanation like, hey, you can't continue the main quest because we haven't investigated that area yet. but being shoehorned into doing side content in between each major plot point felt very bad. Especially when you start realizing that half of them are basic fetch quests, and the other half is go to that zone, talk to 4 different NPCs hidden in there, and then come back all while you're being pummeled by wild Digimon every 5 steps. Even though I liked the visual appeal of each map, despite them being recolors, there was a lot of frustration in there. Fields are way bigger than necessary. They all feel like huge labyrinth, and with the encounter rate still extremely high, you'll spend about 95% of your time in battles. They definitely thought about some quality of life addition here. You're able to use your touchscreen to drag the map around and see roughly where you're going. I feel like that's a solution to a problem that could have been solved by just having smaller encounter rate. Battles also bring in their share of frustration. I remember complaining about that in my previous Digimon video, but it's still very apparent here. Every fight starts with the enemy team loading one by one, and even though they did cut the animation time by a second, it still feels pretty slow. I also mentioned how attack animations feel pretty sluggish. All of this combined makes combat feel repetitive even in the early game. And it's not like the game shies away from grinding. The 30 hours I spent playing Dusk would quickly turn to 10 if I didn't spend most of my time spamming random battles. In World DS, I only ever found myself grinding near the very end, and that's solely because the last boss is known to be a huge roadblock. In Dusk though, every 2 major quests I would turn off OBS and just spam battles until I was confident enough that my team could wipe anything I'd encounter. It's not even like the game's hard. I came in with the knowledge that I would have to grind, that the process of degenerating my team and digivolving them back up was just something I would have to do, and this led to me absolutely decimating anything that stood in my way. It generally felt like I cheaped the game out of half of its encounters because I started min-maxing my team. My Digimon would dish out attacks in the thousands and would only get hit for low 60s. That's without taking equipments into account. If I came into Dusk completely blind, the amount of grinding would have probably discouraged me, but at the same time, deep in my heart, I think there's something exhilarating about number crunching my Digimon into the stratosphere. There's so much optimization you can do, and while I did see it as a flaw at first, I had some really good fun with it. I ended up using pretty much just my starting team the entire game because of how strong I'd gotten them. Maybe also because I didn't have the stomach to raise a new Digimon, but you know, that's just between the two of us. Some of Dusk's additional system also complement that min-maxing even more. While you could spend your time degenerating and digivolving your team back and forth, you could also DNA digivolve 2 Digimon of similar level to give them drastically better stats, or even create new species entirely. Each parent can transfer some of their attacks to their offspring, which effectively creates combination where certain Digimon inherit moves they shouldn't have. It's never outright told to you though. If you want to learn about it, you'll have to talk to a generic NPC in the main hub. But it was still a lot of fun. Digimon World Dusk, like many RPGs of that era, is a game that benefits a lot from having a guide with you. Kind of a shame since the strategy guides never made it outside of Japan. That's what GameFAQs is for, right? Another of my criticism about the game is how it handles its menu. That's something I mentioned in the previous video, and it continues to be an issue here. Menuing takes a lot of time to go through. Degenerating my team would leave them at level 1, and with some equips having level requirements, I just stopped equipping my team because of how tedious it was to put them back on one at a time. Anything from checking your quest objective, using items, to even just checking what level your team digivolves at felt slow. Plenty of stuff from World DS became optional in Dusk. Now that side quests are picked at a counter, the Digifarm is pretty much used only for creating new Digimon, or if you're more into the virtual pet side of things. It's still useful since you can raise your team's stats, but you can also avoid it completely. Wi-Fi battles and trading are still a thing, but you know, Nintendo DS Wi-Fi services shut down a couple years back, and there's no way I'm convincing a friend to play this just to test the wireless function. Tamer rank is also a side activity now instead of the main appeal. Back in World DS, it kinda served as your main quest objective, but now it's used to increase the percentage of scan data you get from any Digimon you encounter. I was kinda surprised with the difficulty curve on those Tamer exams. To go from one rank to another, you gotta face against another Tamer, and I had to stop after I reached Gold. The Platinum fight with Imperial Dramon Paladin mode just kicked my ass so hard I didn't bother trying again. In retrospect, I feel like the mechanics themselves are the main appeal of Dusk. I usually prefer games with a heavy emphasis on their stories and character development, but here stuff like DNA Digivolution and optimizing your team really shine through. Continuing from where I left off earlier, the plot goes roughly like this. In Dawn, rumors have spread that the Nightcrow team is responsible for the recent mysterious happenings. In Dusk, it's the opposite. So with each team pointing fingers at each other, it's up to you to investigate and find out who's really behind the virus. The premise felt really cool, but with each major plot beat requiring you to do 2 side quests before you can continue, it made me feel like the game was artificially extended. Digimon World DS had a similar issue. The plot had some good elements here and there, but they all ended up either cut short or underutilized. Like, something I did enjoy was how the last fight with Kowloon Co. can be completely skipped. They're a minor antagonist group, and you learn from them that they're actually just contract workers for the bigger bad guy, and they don't really have a grudge against you. So you can just bribe them with your money and they'll help you out. Technically, the other option also leads to them helping you, but not without a fight. It's a small thing, but I appreciate it. On the other hand though, there's some very obvious foreshadowing early in the game that leads to absolutely nothing. Pretty early in Dusk, the mysterious cloaked figure tells you that you'll be betrayed by one of your own. So for a while I was almost trying to predict which character it could be, which leads us to Raigo. Also pretty early in the game, you're introduced to him. He's this gold tamer from your team, but he only becomes part of the main plot around the halfway mark. When Chief Julia, the leader of Nitro, disappears, Raigo takes the mantle and acts as your main quest giver for a bit. There's also some background exposition from some of the supporting cast hinting that Raigo might be jealous that Julia's the leader, so I kinda suspected that he would be the mysterious figure, or maybe he's working as a double agent. It's not much, but it got me invested. Thing is, this plot element led to nothing. Raigo just happens to be tsundere that he's not the boss. Chief Julia and part of your team were kidnapped and later mind controlled by the real antagonist, and at that point, most of my interest in the plot went out of the window. I just went back to focusing on what I did find fun, which was optimizing my Digimon and making sure each fight stayed as short as possible. The main story ends with, full spoilers, you and your Digimon infiltrating Sunshine City and breaking everyone out of their mind control. By the time I got to the last dungeon, it was full on power of friendship with both teams cheering on the main character. I really wish I could have liked the ending a bit more. There's some fan service to the previous game, and while I do appreciate the attempt, it fell completely flat to me. Big lore dump, but the main antagonist Grimmon fuses with the Chrono Core, the remnants of the Digi-Entelequia stolen from Calumon in the last game, and when you defeat it, they say some cryptic lines referring to Chronomon, the last boss from World DS. While that game also suffered from a pretty bare-bones story, it at least had some themes that were worth discussing. Pagumon being mistreated because of his actions in a prior life, Alphamon acting for the greater good but accidentally causing mayhem. Stuff you can stop and at least think on for a bit. I hate to say it, but Dusk's ending almost felt comical. I'm sure that the last line about Chronomon was supposed to evoke some sort of emotion, like the big bad guy showing some vulnerability, reminiscing of a time long gone, but it goes straight into the credits with loud happy music, so cool, I guess? I obviously didn't come in expecting Final Fantasy VI levels of storytelling, but at the same time, it felt a bit disappointing. I saw a lot of potential in World DS's story and I was really hoping they'd expand upon it in Dusk. Also, I really don't mean to be an ass about it, but translation's kinda weird. Apparently this comes from the fact that the Japanese team had a gender-neutral script and the localization team didn't take that in mind. First time I was introduced to Chief Glare, they're a lady. Next time, they're a dude. I didn't expect to get some low-key transgender representation in 2007. In the end, it didn't really negatively affect my experience besides the occasional typo and having to double take certain pieces of dialogue. Small side note before I wrap things up, but I was actually really looking forward to clearing the post-game content this time. I heard there was a boss rush and an entire questline that has references to the Digimon Next manga, so I was really excited. While you can still do the former, the Legendary Tamer questline is locked behind doing Wi-Fi content and Platinum Tamer rank, so not gonna happen. In retrospect, I think I was a bit too overhyped for Digimon World Dusk. When it comes to any game I play, especially when I review them, I try to go in as blind as possible, but this time it was a lot harder than I expected. After releasing my previous Digimon video, I've had a lot of people come forward and talk about their own impression on the series. And while it was incredibly insightful, a lot of what I heard was, Digimon Dusk is way better than World DS, it feels like a complete package. And I don't think I agree, at least not entirely. While Dusk did add some new features, it felt a lot like more of the same. A lot of the assets are reused, and knowing that both games released about 9 months apart from each other, I'm willing to bet there were some heavy budgetary constraints, which would probably explain the game's length as well. If we count only the time it took me to go to the main quest and the necessary side quests, excluding only the grinding, I clocked in just a little over 10 hours. Inherently, I don't think Digimon World Dusk is bad. Even though it has its problems and they're worth discussing, I can definitely see why people like this game. If I was still a kid who had an almost infinite supply of time to myself, I would easily get lost in that world, if not for the story, for the mechanics instead. Even if the experience wasn't particularly life-changing, it didn't have to be. Digimon World Dusk allowed me some quiet respite. You know, a thing to mindlessly play through as I whisk away the hours of the early morning, just staring at my DS screen. It's not often I get to do that anymore. Hey, thank you for making it this far and listening to me rant about Digimon for what, 19 minutes now? I'm sure it won't be the last time. If you enjoy what you saw and want to help the channel grow, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to appease my performance anxiety. Don't worry, I'm mostly joking. Unless...